So I always emphasized that transition must only have one direct child element. And because of that, we had to change our base model a little bit here to ensure that transition has only one direct child element. Well, actually, there are exceptions to that rule. There is a scenario where you might have more than one direct child element. And here it is. In AppView, I'm going to add a new div with a class of container, simply to show you a new example inside of that div. And here I'll add a good old button. But now we'll animate the button itself. And I'll have a button here where I say show users, and below that a second button where I say hide users. Well, at the moment we got no users, but for the moment I simply want to switch between these two buttons when we click them, so that we simply animate the switch from show to hide and back. Because we worked with buttons that changed their text before, but whenever we had such a button, the text on the button changed instantly, and we had no animation for that. You might not need that, but if you do, you can build this with the transition component. So first of all, let's make sure we switch between these buttons. For that, we can add click listeners here, point at show users on the first button, and then here at hide users. So show users and hide users, these are two methods we now need to add. And we also need a new data property here, which controls in which mode we are at the moment. Users are visible, could be the name of that property. Initially it's false, let's say. And then we have a method, show users, where I simply set this users are visible to true, and hide users, which is that other method we're pointing at from the other button. And here we can set users are visible to false. So this is just some dummy code, but with that, we're controlling the users are visible property here, the data property, and we can now control which button should be visible based on that property. The first button here should be visible if users are visible is false, because if they are not visible, I want to show the show users button so that we can show them. The other button, therefore, is shown if users are visible is true. If we see the users at the moment, I want to show a hide users button. With that, if we save this, we got this new button, we can click it to switch between these buttons. In reality, that of course would do something else on the page as well, show a list of users, for example, but here I just want to focus on the transition between these two buttons. And I already said it, on the transition. At the moment, it's an instant change, which might or might not be what you want. But if you don't want it, if you want to animate this, you can use the transition component for that and wrap it around these two buttons. And you heard that right, around these two buttons. There is one exception where you are allowed to have more than one direct child element inside of your transition component. And that is the exception here. The exception is if of the child elements you have in your transition, you guarantee that at most one is added to the real DOM at the same time. And that's the case here. We got two alternative if statements, and therefore we guarantee that only one of these two buttons will be added to the real DOM at a time. So if you use transition around elements where only one is added, then this is okay. If there is a chance of both buttons being added to the page at the same time, then this is not okay. So if we had the same if condition here, then this would not be okay because now both buttons would be part of the page. But if we have the opposite if conditions here, then this is okay. Now let's add a nice little transition here. Fade-button is the prefix I will use here, but as always, this is totally up to you. And now down there in the style code, maybe here, I'll add fade button enter from, and then copy this to also add the active and to classes. And let's say we want to start with an invisible button. Then we want to go to a visible button. And we want to animate this with the transition property, where we watch the opacity property. And whenever that changes, which it does here, whenever that changes, we want to let CSS animate that change over .3 seconds. And now we can also add the classes for removing a button. And now for the first time I will reuse some code, because my enter from state is also my leave to state. My enter to state is also my leave from state. And I will have a separate active state though, because I want to use a different easing function. So fade button leave active. There I set up a transition watching the opacity over .3 seconds with a ease in function. If I would use ease out here, we could of course also have merged it with this CSS rule, but I want to use ease in here. So now here I'm reusing a little bit of code instead of writing everything twice. I did it before to be more explicit, but now I think we got the idea, so we can write less code here. And if I now save that, we get an error. Transition expects exactly one child element or component. Now I just emphasized that it would be fine to have multiple elements if we guarantee that only one is shown at the same time. Well, the problem is Vue doesn't understand that these if conditions here guarantee us that only one button is added. It doesn't analyze the if conditions. So in order to give Vue a clear signal that it's either that or that component, we should use velse here. Because velse is pretty clear. With velse, we guarantee that only this or this component is shown. That will never have both on the screen at the same time. So now with that added, this works. And now you see we have this smooth transition here. When a button is removed, it fades out. When it's added, it fades in. But of course it's also ugly because it jumps, and during the transition we actually have both buttons on the screen, which by the way is okay here because this is now controlled by Vue. So this is certainly not what we want. We want this fade transition, but we don't want both buttons at the same time on the screen. Instead, one button should fade out and then the other button should fade in. That's the idea. And that's also something you can control. You can add the mode prop here to the transition component. And mode knows two values, in out and out in. And this controls whether first the leaving element should be animated or the new element. So if I set this to in out and reload, we got the same behavior as before, or a similar behavior. Now the addition of the button is animated first, and then the button is removed. We can switch this to out in, and now we'll have a better behavior. With out in, if we reload, Vue will first animate the removal of the button and then animate the addition of the new button. So this allows you to control which element should be animated first, instead of animating both at the same time, which gave us this undesirable output. Now we're having a smooth animation with help of transition and multiple child elements, which is okay, as you learned, if you know that only one of them will be active at the same time, and you can give a clear signal with vif velse to Vue that this will be the case.